Okay then, so in this video we're going to be looking at Khrushchev and how he dealt with dissent, i.e. those who opposed his rule, and also culture and the cultural thought which took place under his time as Russian leader. Now, the first thing is, in many respects, he has some great similarities with previous Soviet leaders and previous Tsars, in the fact that he wanted to maintain his power and would deal with opponents by removing them if they threatened his power. And he also was very keen and relied upon the secret police, again as a way of controlling people, controlling dissent, finding out who were opposing him, etc., etc. Now, he was, though, quite different to Stalin, because Stalin, as we all know, was extremely brutal. His secret police basically was controlled by him and his appointee, a man like Beria. And as we know from that previous work we did, Khrushchev actually got rid of Stalin's secret police, formed the KGB, and actually made it more accountable to the Communist Party itself. Although, as we know, he actually, dominated the Communist Party, especially its central organs. So in that respect, you might question how different it actually was. On his rise to power, you'll notice that, with the exception of Beria, no one else was actually shot or murdered under Khrushchev, unlike Stalin's rise to power. His opponents were often demoted, but they lived out their lives in kind of semi-exile or, in some kind of inferior positions. The secret police under Khrushchev was far less brutal than Stalin. Stalin's secret police, used physical pain and torture to try and get things out of people, whereas the KGB, you might argue, tend to use more psychological methods. Again, whether that's better or worse than painful methods, I'll leave that up to you, I suppose. But they did rely a lot on informants to find out what people were thinking, to find out what the dissent was. They kept record of what informants said. They used tactics, of questioning, which used psychological interrogation, so being questioned in the middle of the night, being asked the same question again and again and again, being isolated from other people as well, so you don't actually often had isolation. And when they moved around the prisons to go to interrogations, if you ever go to the Stasi building in East Germany, in Berlin, they have like little red and green lights, so the only person they'd ever see was the guard taking them to the interrogation, not any other prisoners or anything like that. And these methods were replicated in the Eastern Bloc in places like East Germany with their secret police called the Stasi. And here's a picture of the main prison, the Stasi, in Berlin. Well worth going to if you ever get a chance to go to Berlin. And there's a book on Moodle by this guy who kind of explains the tactics used by the Stasi in Germany. So again, it's well worth having a look at. Now, there was one serious uprising under Khrushchev. As we know, there's that attempted coup against him in 1957, but there's one serious uprising by ordinary people. And I use the word uprising in inverted commas, I think, here. This was in 1962 in this place called Novocherkassk, or something like that. And it was triggered by rising food prices. Again, this is a consequence of the Virgin Land Scheme not working properly, and all these other agricultural reforms not having the desired effect. Food became a little short. There wasn't a famine, but food became a little short, and of course that led to prices of food going up. And this triggered off a series of strikes in this particular location. You saw demonstrations with people having banners with pictures of Lenin on and things of that nature. And on the second day of these strikes, the security forces actually opened fire on the crowds. This was very much hushed up under the Soviet Union. Officially, 22 people died, but we don't actually know what the true numbers were. And as I said, it was kept really quiet under the Soviet Union, and even until the end of Gorbachev. It wasn't really until the fall of Gorbachev or that latter period of his rule of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, where this uprising became, some of the documents about it kind of were released. Today, we can see here, this is Vladimir Putin recognising this uprising in 1962 by laying flowers at a memorial. So today it is remembered a lot more than it was. But notice here, there's some great similarities with previous Russian leaders, uprisings being dealt with brutally by force. Again, this is the actions of all dictators, isn't it? And again, it shows that Khrushchev was actually no different when there was opposition to him. Now, the other element of Khrushchev was you did see a cultural thaw that took place. So obviously under Stalin, everything was very regimented, controlled by Stalin, Soviet realism ruled, all of that type of stuff. But under Khrushchev, there was a thawing of the culture. There was a relaxation, I suppose, some of the controls over Russian culture. And because of de-Stalinization, you did see this relaxation of the censorship which Stalin had imposed upon artists and all other kind of cultural elements of society. As part of de-Stalinization, Khrushchev allowed criticism to be made of Stalin himself. Now, you were not able to criticize communism, you weren't able to criticize the Communist Party, or Lenin, or the revolution, but you could begin to criticize Stalin and the brutal methods which he used. And it wasn't always very subtle. So here we got a poem, or part of a poem, by Antolsky, whatever his name is, in 1956, which says, "He who has died we hate, less than our silence." There's no kind of Nobel Prize for recognising who has died we hate. It's referring to Stalin. I don't think he was a great fan. You also saw books being written which became quite popular about the terrible experiences from the labour camps. It doesn't seem like bedtime reading, but anyway, I suppose people today and then still like reading about brutal things which people do to each other. One example was this book by Solzhenitsyn called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was about the daily life in a labour camp, and it kind of highlighted, the freezing conditions and the hard work, and the guard making them work all hours God sends, and having like a little bit of gruel for your tea, that type of stuff. But as I said before, it was not okay to criticise the communist system itself or the revolution. And this guy, Mr. Pasternak, actually did that. Interestingly, Mr. Pasternak, he was around under Stalin as well, and Stalin actually quite liked him, even though he was a bit on the edge sometimes, and sometimes he wrote things which Stalin didn't really approve of. Stalin kind of protected him for some reason. It seems to be someone who Stalin seemed to quite like. After Stalin died, though, Pasternak wrote this book called Dr. Zhivago. It was since went into a film, and I think I said this before, it actually was on BBC 4 in about the middle of September. Well worth watching if you have the time. But it gave an un-Soviet view of the revolution. So it kind of says the revolution went wrong, I suppose, is the general gist of it. As a consequence, the book was banned in the Soviet Union. Copies, though, did leak out to the West, who, as part of the Cold War and some of that kind of propaganda against the Soviet Union, were very keen to publish it widely in the West. It received a Nobel Peace Prize, but Pasternak was denied the right to go and collect this Peace Prize. Not Peace Prize, Literature Prize, the Nobel Prize for Literature it received. And of course, the film as well was made, and again it really highlighted, it was used as part of the propaganda of the West against the Soviet Union, but it was banned within the USSR. It was only towards the end of Gorbachev's time in the late 1980s that it actually was allowed to be published in the Soviet Union itself, and it very quickly became a bestseller. Now, Khrushchev also had some interesting views about contemporary art. Soviet realism was kind of thrown out under Khrushchev, or was no longer the only type of art that was allowed. And you did see some modern contemporary art, that stuff where you can't tell what it is, isn't it? Says me from an untrained eye. Now, to give an idea of this, I think it's quite funny. In 1962, he visits this art gallery called the Manaz Contemporary Art Gallery in Moscow itself, and here's a picture of him, looking at some of the artistic works. So there's some sculptures here and whatever else. Anyway, one of them he took exception to, and Khrushchev shouts out, "It's dog shit. A donkey could smear better than this with his tail." So that was his kind of art critique of this piece of modern art. And ironically, one of the sculptors who he insulted, or one of the sculptors, would be better, he insulted was this guy called Nezemsk, whatever his name was. And actually, once Khrushchev fell from power, they actually made friends with this guy. And then when Khrushchev died, before he died, he asked this guy would he design his tomb for him. And he did so in a very contemporary style, which we can see here. This is Khrushchev's tomb. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it, how we can see red and white. So, black and white, does that represent his bad side and his good side? I'm not entirely sure. It's all a little bit haphazard as well, which again, I think kind of sums up kind of Khrushchev's character a bit, doesn't it? It was a little bit kind of haphazard in many ways. So he had interesting views about contemporary art, I think it's probably fair to say. So that's the main thing about Khrushchev and Dissent and culture. Dissent he didn't like if it threatened his power, his authority. However, and he was prepared to use violence on that threat. You look at that uprising, which I mentioned before. Also think about how he happily sent the tanks into Hungary and Eastern Europe during those uprisings. However, the KGB was reformed and there was a thawing of culture and criticisms were allowed, but only of certain things under Khrushchev.